My name is Victor. I am the occult technician, and this is Mind War, episode 4. Again, we're working from a book titled Mind War, written by Dr. Michael Aguino. Mind War was written as a strategy for global peace. We are taking the tactics of the book Mind War, we are adapting them to our personal lives in order to achieve peace on a personal scale. So, where we left off, again, the Aristos is our goal. That is the best possible scenario for our given situation. We're taking a true and honest look at the situation that we are currently in. That is, where do we live? Who do we live with? What are some of the limitations on what we can do? Maybe it's financially, culturally, right? We take a minute to do an honest evaluation to understand what we can and cannot change. And within that, we start to create the mind war matrix, which is basically setting our goals. What are we going to change in our lives to help that scenario? With the scenario change, then we can change our situation, right? Maybe something as simple as career advancement. So taking the time to actually begin studying now. You covertly start studying for a new certificate, which is going to either advance you in your company or maybe help you find a new career, find a job somewhere else, right? Within those changes, within the army of one, that is who we are. We ourselves represent the entire army in our mind war. We understand that the different branches, the different sections that we have within ourselves, right? So we talked about the civil affairs section, right? And the civil affairs in the army is meant to reestablish infrastructure for the citizenry after a physical war. For us, maybe it's simply cleaning our room, right? Making room in our living space to begin our artistic pursuits or our educational pursuits. Or maybe we're trying to learn music, so we need a place to do that. Whatever it may be, whatever that change may be in your life. Our special forces group within ourselves, right? For the Army, they're meant to help train other militaries in the whatever the combat situation is that they're in. For us, our personal special forces, maybe thinking and achieving new physical goals, right? Eating healthier, exercising more. That is our personal special forces group. And then the psychological operations group, right? For the Army, that is meant to propagandize the enemy, propagandize the citizenry of the combat zone in order to get them to agree with these changes and agree with new outcomes, right? For us, that psychological operations group within us, within our army of one, that is going to be how we interact with the people in our lives and introduce them to the changes that we've made. Sometimes, in order to make a personal change successful, the people around us have to change a little bit also, right? So these are some of the tactics that we are adapting from a global scale, and we are adapting them to our own personal lives to win the mind war. We are starting this episode on page 61, chapter 3, Mind War Branch, formerly known as the Psychological Operations Branch. It's kind of fun to do the impossible. Walt Disney. The Mind War Branch insignia replaces the old PSYOP branch. The old concepts. Number 1, psychological operations. Psychological operations, or PSYOP, is an often misunderstood term, and both it and its specialized aspects will bear clarification prior to the discussion of its role in the American military culture and its evolution into mind war from the U.S. Army's final PSYOP manual. Psychological operations. Planned operations to convey selected information and indicators to foreign audiences to influence their emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of foreign governments, organizations, groups, and individuals. The purpose of psychological operations is to induce or reinforce foreign attitudes and behaviors favorable to the originator's objectives. So that's the goal of the psychological operations, right? Influence emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately behavior. So we see that often in our own lives. Again, if we live in tyrannical households with strict religions or strict political beliefs, you are constantly being attacked with psychological operations to make sure that your thinking fits within the desired or the already created and established mindset, the already established culture. And sometimes breaking out of that means waking up to the PSYOP that you are a part of. Waking up to the PSYOP that you are a victim of. You all hear what I'm saying here? Whatever that PSYOP that is being run against you is, and I promise you there is, probably multiple, from all sorts of angles, you have to become aware of it. Only then, through that honest look at our lives, can we set our mind war matrix and achieve the goals of winning the mind war. Number 2, psychological warfare. The related and more traditional term psychological warfare had been retired to the Orwellian memory hole in 2007, but previously, psychological warfare is the planned use of propaganda and other psychological actions to influence the opinions, emotions, attitudes, and behavior of hostile foreign groups in such a way as to support the achievement of national objectives. Note that it is these definitions per se, there is no mention of the truth or of the United States commitment to it. There are simply mission-oriented definitions. To be sure, they could be phrased thus to encompass the PSYOP and PSY-war of all nations, not just the United States. The implication of this definition, thus, is U.S. PSYOP manuals, however, is that it is the way we look at them, right? So again, we have to remember that it is psychological operations, psychological warfare that is being brought against us from all sorts of different directions, whether it is people in your personal lives through their bad behavior, right? And that bad behavior may be simply ingrained cultural things. That's just the way that we do it, right? That's just how it's always been done, right? That you can be beat down through those psychological tools that are coming against you. And again, we take an honest look at those things to understand how we can create our mind war matrix to overcome them. So number 3 is propaganda. The stock and trade of pre-mind war PSYOP was propaganda, which is any form of communication in support of national objectives designed to influence the opinions, emotions, attitudes, or behavior of any group in order to benefit the sponsor either directly or indirectly. Despite exhaustive efforts to respectabilize it, propaganda as a concept still labors under the negative image Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda ministry created during the Third Reich. Goebbels' passion for the utility of propaganda led him to an arrogant contempt for uncontrollable, purposeless information. In his eyes, the motivational and indoctrinational goals of the German propaganda effort fully justified the complete selection and packaging of information as might be convenient or expedient. Success is the important thing. Propaganda is not a matter for average minds, but rather a matter for practitioners. It is not supposed to be lovely or theoretically correct. I do not care if I give wonderful, aesthetically elegant speeches or speak so that women cry. The point of a political speech is to persuade people of what we think right. I speak differently in the provinces than I do in Berlin. And when I speak in Beirut, I say different things than I say in Forest Hall. That is a matter of practice, not of theory. We do not want to be a movement of a few straw brains, but rather a movement that can conquer the broad masses. Propaganda should be popular, not intellectually pleasing. It is not the task of propaganda to discover intellectual truths. So again, propaganda in our personal lives is when we start to introduce those around us to the changes that have been made, that we're making in our own lives to better ourselves, whether they like it or not. And depending on your audience, your propaganda will be different. Again, you are a young person still living with your parents. The way that you express these changes to your father may be different than the way you express these changes to your mother. Okay? Same thing if you are at work. You may talk to your boss about the changes you're making in your life in a much more covert manner, right? They don't need to know everything that you're planning on doing. But if you have a trusted coworker, someone you consider a friend, maybe they can get a little bit more information about the courses that you're taking and the job that you plan on applying for, whether inside or outside of the company, right? So there are different levels of propaganda, and again, you have to fashion them to the audience that you're speaking to. It is thus not surprising that today, in most people's eyes, propaganda has simply become a synonym for utilitarian unconcern with the truth. In the above cited American definition, the standard by which propaganda is measured is a mission-oriented one, in which national interest is the determining factor. Once more, this definition can be excused as applicable to all propaganda, not just that of the United States. But in that case, the door is again left open for the U.S. to utilize propaganda per the same rationale, at least up to 1979, but curiously absent from all subsequent manuals. The Army made the following statement concerning propaganda. U.S. Army propaganda is based on a strategy of truth. It seeks to strengthen or create a favorable image by emphasizing the credible truth. This is so because the complete truth is frequently not believable by the target audience. Dedication to the truth does not imply that a full recounting of facts is required or advisable. Facts to support certain themes may be selected while others may be excluded. The propagandist reports those facts that present his side in the best light. So again, when propagandizing those in your life, you have different audiences, And different information is going to be relayed. But one of the important parts that we see in this definition of propaganda is that truth is involved. You have to involve some aspect of truth, right? Again, if you're deciding to make a spiritual or religious change in a totalitarian style religious household, it's going to be very difficult to espouse some of the truths of why you're making that change. Telling the people that you love and that are close to you that their religious beliefs are harmful to you or that you don't feel a connection to them is going to be very difficult. So the propaganda that you set up for them has to be very specific, maybe gentle, right? Propaganda doesn't always have to hit you over the head with extreme imagery and extreme messages. Sometimes it can be subtle, right? Use the different tactics that are available to you when making change. What differentiates a strategy of truth from just the truth is the truth uttered merely because it is thought to be less vulnerable than lies, or because of a commitment to it that is above and beyond motives of advantage or expedience. And is the selective presentation of facts and exclusion of others bearing upon the situation justifiably considered the truth, even if done to enhance the credibility of a message to an audience? In traditional battlefield janitor miso, propaganda frequently takes the form of simple, crude messages directed at low-level physical war combatants, coaxing them to retreat, defect, or revolt. The motivations invoked are similarly basic: fear, greed, comfort, personal safety, and vengeance. Its effectiveness is directly proportionate to battlefield condition. Victorious soldiers will ignore it, while defeated ones will clutch at it. Either way, it is recognized as something inherently insulting and shameful to the recipient, an image which reflects back upon its ostensible source, the United States. Dissemination of crude propaganda also undermines the effectiveness of any higher echelon actions targeting leadership, simply by springing from the same source. If the United States is perceived to be cynical and contemptuous to one level, it will be seen through this lens on all levels, right? So again, propaganda that is based on fear, greed, comfort, personal safety, and vengeance, that is going to be more extreme, right? That's going to catch people's attention, but it may result in a negative reaction. And when you are propagandizing people about the healing changes that you're making to your life, you don't want them to see it in a negative light. And it's going to be difficult to control their perceptions, but it's going to be something that you will be able to do. And it's based on what type of propaganda message you are providing to them, when you provide it to them, right? Are you going to wait until a moment when the person that you're going to talk about these changes with, when they're tired and they're angry and they're unhappy and they're already dealing with all kinds of trouble in their own lives? Is that when you want to spring this new propaganda on them? No. Maybe you wait until things are calmer, right? Or maybe you do need to hit them when they're tired and they're angry, right? Maybe you do need to hit them with something. Add another layer of suffering to their life, which really helps push them to the point where they will start to recognize it. Because they start to realize, oh, these things that I'm doing aren't just hurting those around me, but they're hurting me too, right? It all depends on when you when you create your strategy of propaganda in your mind war matrix, how are you going to introduce the changes you've made in your life to the people in your life? Propaganda's effectiveness is inversely proportional to the degree of belief and behavior modification it proposes. To understand this, the propagandist must realize that people do not change their minds. Rather, they reinterpret and reevaluate their existing thought patterns of reality as they are so motivated. So again, coming out very quickly, you decide that you want to make a religious change, but before implementing it in your own life and seeing what those changes, what the results are going to be, instead on day one, you just start telling everyone, I'm not going to be this religion that our family has practiced anymore. I'm going to go do a radical new religion. If you propagandize that on day one with a crude and extreme message, it's going to be met with anger. It's going to be met with force and violence against it. Maybe not physical violence, but mind war, emotional, psychological violence towards you, right? They will double down on the traditional religion that your family has practiced and force you to go back even harder, right? So again, we have to be careful when we do our propagandizing. And that's simply when we start to tell people about the changes in our lives. We implement them first covertly. We allow them to sink in, become concrete. We see positive results from our changes. And when others start to recognize it in our lives, that's when we start to propagandize them. Here's what we've done. Here's what we plan to continue doing, whether you like it or not. Number 4, the shades. Confusion over the terms white, gray, and black propaganda is common, so it may be helpful to review their definition as well before proceeding further. Note that all 3 shades of propaganda are source determined. The color coding does not refer to its truthfulness of the propaganda message itself. White propaganda is propaganda in which the source is openly and accurately stated. Gray propaganda is propaganda in which no source is stated. And black propaganda is propaganda in which the source is deliberately and explicitly misrepresented. Okay, a few different shades of propaganda, talking about the source. Where did this information come from? And again, when you're trying to make changes maybe in a political household, you're starting to say, listen, I don't agree with this wing of politics that our family is so controlled by. And maybe you find information from sources that the audience you are trying to propagandize from. You find information from those sources that may go against the belief system. But because they already believe and trust that source of information, that's when you use that white propaganda. You say, hey, you know, on your favorite news channel, I saw an article the other day that stated this. That's very strange. That goes against what we've been told in the past, right? Or maybe you find a piece of information that comes from a source that you know that they are not going to accept, and maybe you have to misrepresent where that information came from. As long as the information gets to them and makes the audience member change their mind, change their perception, who cares, right? The goal was established and successfully accomplished. Number 5, general parameters. What is evident in the above definitions is that PSYOP is is generally understood to be mission justified, and further that its potential use includes deliberate falsehood. These features do not in themselves invalidate PSYOP as a U.S. policy option, any more than a rifle's potential for unethical use invalidates its place as a tool in support of ethical ends. What is important is that, like the rifle, PSYOP can be used unethically just as easily as it can be used ethically. The mere fact that it is the United States who employs it does not in itself validate it from an ethical standpoint. Again, we see constant forms of unethical propaganda used against us every day. Whether it is a personal issue that you're dealing with, the people around you who are lying to you, giving you complete falsehoods, skewing information to better fit their narratives, right? It's happening. And then we see it on a much larger scale too. We see the corporations, institutions, religions in our life also using this crude, slanderous type of propaganda against us to make us believe that any change outside of their norm, outside of the cultural norm that has already been created, is somehow evil. It's bad. Don't do it. But that's what we're fighting here. That's the mind war. That's why we work every day and train every day as mind warriors to overcome that current mind war battlefield that we're in, to overcome these crude, negative propaganda that is coming against us on a daily basis. Number 6, beyond propaganda, the influence continuum. The rationale for propaganda is that if a believable message is delivered to an audience, that audience will modify its behavior accordingly. This is based on two assumptions: that people construct their beliefs and attitudes by reason, and that they can be further inspired to act in furtherance of them by reason. As examined below under thought architecture, this is a fatally flawed misapprehension. 95% of human thinking is subconscious and further takes the form of response to accustomed patterns. Only the remaining 5% is conscious, and only part of that is the consequence of reason. In his current examination of the science of PSYOP, Dr. Gregory Cease rejects the usefulness of propaganda entirely. Indeed, the P word is not mentioned even once therein. Within the realm of conscious, reasoned thought, Cease identifies a 5-stage influence continuum from the least to the most forceful. Number 1, education and information. Number 2, persuasion. Number 3, compliance. Number 4, coercion. And number 5, thought reform. In PSYOP campaigns, the first 4 of these may be employed both independently and concertedly as the situation demands them. With their effectiveness disadvantage is that it is a difficult system to improve by inspired or intellectual leadership, since political power is concentrated in majority opinion, which tends to be sluggish, conservative, complacent, and apathetic, unless a crisis shocks it into action. Political power can be corrupted through the economic, social, and demagogic manipulation of the people. The self-evident truths in this perceptual universe are accepted as articles of faith which need no argumentative justification. Indeed, to question the assumptions underlying the Constitution would be viewed as a kind of quasi-religious heresy, as indeed it is from a philosophical perspective. The social contract theorists of the Enlightenment held a vague, general disbelief that God, if he were presumed to exist, would disregard the operation of natural laws to take an interest in the behavior of individual human beings for better or worse. Generally termed deism, this belief system included such founding fathers as George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Paine. They therefore designed ideal government systems in which human reason was preeminent, with traditional Judeo-Christian divine influence being relegated to a ceremonial and symbolic role in actual political decision making. So again, we often find ourselves mired in the cultural belief system, also known as, well, this is just how we've always done it. This is how the generations before me believed, so I believe in that same religion or political structure as well. Those in that mindset, when it comes to their opinion, in changing their opinion, are often sluggish, conservative, complacent, and apathetic. It's very difficult to get people who are mired in those long-held cultural beliefs to make any changes. And it often requires a crisis shock to make any changes. So I'm not going to go into detail, but I'm guessing many of you can look back on, say, the last few years to a crisis shock event, which shocked people out of their complacency and introduced a new way of living, a new situation that we find ourselves in. And this has happened in my lifetime multiple times, right? And I don't think that the major events in my lifetime that have shocked the world into a new way of living, I don't think those are over. I'm guessing in my lifetime I will see many more, and so will you. Number 2, individual ethics. Ethics, alternatively called moral philosophy, seeks to distinguish what is good from what is bad and to formulate justifiable reasons for making such distinctions. Philosophy generally refers to the rational examination of an individual's or group's core principles. So real quick, a group determining what is good and bad. That can be as small a group as your family. What does your family think is good and bad? Then that goes up to maybe your school, your church, your corporation that you work for, the neighborhood you're in, the culture that you're a part of, right? Those things change for everyone. You have to, before you begin to interact with those different groups and organizations, you need to understand what their cultural viewpoint of good and bad is, right? Because if you attack what they think is good in a crude manner, they're never going to change. They're going to build their defenses up higher. So be very cautious. Make sure you understand who and what they are and what they believe. As a branch of philosophy, ethics is a normative science. That is, it seeks to identify principles of good and evil that transcend social, cultural, and political convention. Much of that has changed in our current culture. What we at one time thought was bad is now considered good, and vice versa. We are in changing times. It's very difficult for some people to accept those changes, and that's why we see something called the culture war going on right now. The culture war is just a specific battle of the ongoing mind war, which we are all combatants in. Beyond a merely normative approach to ethics is metaethics, which seeks to investigate normative currency terms such as good, evil, justice, ought, right, and wrong. The neutrality and objectivity of metaethics presume that such terms are not dependent upon moral beliefs, such as religion. The metaethical concept of naturalism, advanced by theorists such as John Dewey and Herbert Spencer, posits that moral terms have a basis in scientific fact. Intuitionists agree that moral terms have an external, reliable basis, but attribute it to self-evident. I know it when I see it qualities. So basically what we're talking here is good and evil doesn't have to just be defined by religion. When you hurt someone physically and you see them cry, when you see them in pain based on what you physically did to them, that is evil. It's pretty evident upon most cultures throughout history that that is an evil thing. It may be justified because of other layers of culture and thought placed upon it, but when you get down to the very naturalism of it, we understand that physically harming people is an act of evil. Again, you can justify it because of nonsensical concepts, right? But ultimately, at its base nature, harming others is evil. Challenging intuitionists and naturalists are moral skeptics who insist that moral terms are completely arbitrary. Emotivists claim that such terms have no capacity for being true or false in themselves, and that the people who use them are simply stating their emotions about an issue. Subjectivists maintain that moral judgments state subjective facts only about attitudes, not the objects of those attitudes. And imperativists insist that moral judgments are actually commands. In another guise, hence, do not focus at all on criteria of truth or objectivity. When even its basic language terms are so fraught with controversy, normative ethics is off to a rough start. Beyond this are arguments over the criteria for making any kind of moral judgment. Teleologists maintain that the morality of an action is determined solely by its consequences. Some teleologists, such as Plato, insist that the perfection of the self is the correct consequence. Hedonists say that it is mere pleasure. Utilitarians counter that it must be the greatest benefit to society. Theologians, such as Aquinas, Luther, dispense that teleology altogether in favor of obedience to proclaimed and perceived morality from a god or gods. The sharpest attack on ethics generally comes from egoists, such as Thomas Hobbes and Friedrich Nietzsche, who consider all ethics as verbal camouflage to conceal the reality that all actions are merely in the interest of the stronger, who by that same strength dictate all definitions of justice and right. The egoist position was represented in the Platonic dialogue, The Republic, by Glaucon, and went on to form the basis for Enlightenment, social contract theories, which Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau were in justice and related terms became just matters of agreement and contract between the people of a society. So here again, we are going outside of kind of that naturalist reasoning, that naturalist understanding of the basics of life, right? Pain and comfort, right? We can think of being comfortable as a good thing and being in pain as a bad thing. That seems like it should be a universal moral. But for some it's not, because they try to justify those things They try to justify causing pain to others based on external belief systems. They often justify it in order to maintain their own comfort. Interesting, right? Instead of causing other people's pain in order to maintain your own comfort, think if we as humanity simply focused on comfort for all. Would that be a nice strategy for the mind war? The overall global mind war that all of us in humanity find ourselves combatants in. What if instead of fighting each other, we fought specifically against non-comfort issues, right? Ensuring that everyone is healthy and fed and warm and cared for. If we can focus on some of those very basic natural needs, so much of this other stuff would just melt away. It wouldn't be necessary.
Three, two, one. Wake up, open your eyes.
Accordingly, it is not surprising that practical problem solvers shy away from metaethical issues and try rather to address questions in terms of what are generally called descriptive ethics, the customs and standards of a given culture which serve as measurements of rightness and wrongness within the culture. An acceptance of descriptive ethics, as ethics leads to an attitude of ethical relativism, according to which there is no standard for judging right and wrong apart from the cultural environment of specific situations. Hence, the killing of humans by humans may be ethical if sanctioned by a judge or national sovereign, but the identical act may be unethical if undertaken by an individual regardless of reasons. Not to get too far off course here, folks, but that is exactly a situation that we see every day in our lives, right? We see individuals who are attacked by other individuals. And when they go to defend themselves and fight back, they are the ones that ultimately are punished. Because when you defend yourself and fight back as an individual, we are told that is against the law. But when a nation state, when a government says it's fine to go and attack others and kill others, well, that's ethical, that's justified. We see this happening every day. It is a hypocrisy that has stained the world. It is a hypocrisy that doesn't protect us as individuals. It is a hypocrisy that puts us in danger every day because of these arbitrary rules, these arbitrary laws that say when we defend ourselves against our attackers and we fight back, it is our fight that is lawless, which is a lie. Until the Enlightenment of the late 17th and 18th centuries, ethical philosophy was completely metaethical. Standards of good and evil were accepted as being prescribed by one or more divinities or divine principles. It was humanity's task not to determine ethics, but rather to understand and obey divinely ordained ethics. Inherent in the American military culture, at least theoretically, is the responsibility of each individual for his own ethical behavior and for the issuance of ethical commands to subordinates. Although the oath of military service also stipulates obedience to superior authority, this is theoretically subordinate to one's personal ethical responsibility and cannot be used to excuse unethical acts. This, of course, was raised to the level of explicit doctrine as a consequence of the post-World War II Nuremberg trials, in which German officials had unsuccessfully argued that their oaths of obedience to the leadership superseded, hence, excused actions on their part which outraged prevailing Western norms. The word theoretically appears twice in the above paragraph for a deliberate reason. Although the so-called Nuremberg Principle was officially accepted by the United States, it is a difficult standard to apply or enforce in practice. The reason for this difficulty ought now to be clear. It requires individuals to make decisions according to ethical criteria which they do not understand save as vague articles of faith. The best that can be hoped for is a stoic reliance upon impressions of situations to be reliable ones. Stoicism was a philosophical system holding that it is man's duty to freely conform to natural law and his destiny, that virtue is the highest good, and that the wise man should be free from passion, equally unperturbed by joy or grief. First introduced by Zeno, a somewhat mysterious Phoenician Egyptian, it was later espoused by Chrysippus, Cicero, Seneca, Epictetus, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius of Rome. In the social contract atmosphere of the Enlightenment and American Revolution, judgment of such situational impressions was generally taken to be based upon what the philosopher David Hume described as prevailing passionate custom. According to this standard, reason may be used to discover the fitting, the most practical or sensible approach, but not the morally good. Hence, virtue and vice are products of sentiment. Virtue is not approved because it is virtue. It is considered to be virtue because it meets with passionate approval. Even with such conventionalized guidelines, it is difficult for a soldier, particularly of junior rank and or limited education, to venture an ethical judgment overruling that of a senior. There is always the excuse that the senior is presumed to be aware of and has taken into consideration aspects of the situation which the junior is ignorant. Now, here is a slightly personal story that might be a good example of what we're talking about here. Throughout my lifetime and throughout American culture, alcohol has constantly been promoted. It is famed, it is espoused from every institution. You cannot escape alcohol, right? It's everywhere. From sports, we see small aspects of it in religion. Every institution where food is enjoyed, alcohol always seems to follow. Any type of entertainment venue, alcohol is there. It's constantly promoted and it's constantly pushed, despite the fact that we know how damaging alcohol is to the human body, right? So when I was in the military as a young Marine, I didn't drink. I was not someone who ever really enjoyed alcohol. I tried it a few times prior to my enlistment, and it always ended up in a negative situation. So I didn't drink. It wasn't something that I liked doing. But through kind of intense coercion by those around me in the military, I gave in and I started drinking. And sadly, that resulted in years of alcoholism, years of poisoning myself and damaging my health and my relationships and my career. Thankfully, for me, the damage wasn't nearly as bad as it was for others, but it was still enough for me to put down the bottle one day and say, what am I doing? This is poison. This is killing me. And as part of the work that I do here, one of my crusades, if you will, is against alcohol and against alcoholism. And I hope in future art projects I make that more clear, right? These giant corporations and the institutions and the culture that pushes alcohol upon us is a David and Goliath type story. And as Davids, we are down here saying alcohol is killing people. It should not be celebrated the way that it is. And so we look around and we see the enemy of alcoholism all around us. It's an easy target to attack, but it is massive. And it's going to take a lot of work for us to change that cultural attitude, right? We see all kinds of controversy surrounding alcohol today. And they are completely ridiculous because they do not address the fact that alcohol is poison and it's killing you. It's destroying your life. Instead, we focus on arbitrary nonsense related, to alcohol, but not addressing the alcohol itself. Okay? And that's what we're talking about here. The different prevailing customs in which we live, they're not always perfect. Again, just because that's how we've always done it doesn't mean that it's right. It's part of the mind war. Right now, we are living through a new American revolution. It is not a revolution that is going to be fought on the battlefield with traditional weapons of war. It is not a physical war. We've talked about this before. The revolution that is occurring right now is a mind war. This is our chance to create new, healing culture. A culture of growth. A culture of enlightenment like we talked about here. A culture of peace instead of war. Number 3, law of physical war. The United States has devoted an extensive and exhaustive publication, the Law of War Manual, published in 2015 by the Department of Defense General Counsel, in support of physical war ethics. Unfortunately, the same manual blanket exempts the United States from compliance with it, reducing it to a mere propaganda exercise. This manual represents the legal views of the Department of Defense. This manual does not, however, preclude the department from subsequently changing its interpretation of the law. Although the preparation of this manual has benefited from the participation of lawyers from the Department of State and the Department of Justice, this manual does not necessarily reflect the views of any other department or agency of the United States government or the views of the United States government as a whole. This manual is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity against the United States, its departments, agencies, or other entities, its officers or employees, or any other person. You create a law of war manual and exempt yourself from it. That doesn't make any sense. Number 4, the worth of the individual. As the individual is placed at the center of the Lockean universe, being in effect a sacred object, each individual's ethics are an essential personal responsibility. In certain other cultures, the individual is considered to be a mere component of the state, or of a class, or of an ethnic group. In such cases, the right and responsibility to determine and judge ethics is similarly removed. This point is related to that discussed immediately above, the Nuremberg Principle, but is separate in that it takes each individual to be ethical, whether or not commands from a superior are involved. Within the American military, most conspicuously in the officer corps, there is a further expectation that professional ethics be acknowledged and observed. These ethics are couched in terms of one's responsibility to one's service, fellow service members, and country. They do not address ethics beyond the Lockean universe, and indeed it would probably be worrisome to the nation if they did. The armed forces exist to preserve and protect the United States as it is defined by the Constitution, after all, not to presume to judge that definition. To the extent that American military thinking is thus bounded by constitutional values, military leaders are uncomfortable venturing outside that ordered environment. Conventional military wisdom is simply to war against and defeat those who think and act in ways that are perceived as an unacceptable threat to the United States, with the expectation that they will then see the error of their ways and be converted to right thinking. Persistent rogues will be dispatched. The psychology is essentially similar to that of the medieval crusades, wherein it was thought entirely proper to win converts to Christianity or Islam at sword point. Again, that culture that we find ourselves in is multi-layered and is often crushing. In many ways, it's unavoidable. It's inescapable, the culture that we find ourselves in. Even though, as we said here, the Lockean universe states that each of us are the center of our own ethical universe, which is true. People are going to have different ethical standards. Again, we can go back to that naturism, where we know that natural law states very simple things. Pain is bad, comfort is good, right? Of course, in not all forms. Sometimes the pain of exercise is good, right? The pain of a hard day's work is good. But when you physically cause others to be in pain, right? That's not good. We want to avoid those things. But our personal ethics may not always be in line with the cultural ethics. And that can be very difficult to break out of, because as soon as you start to sway from the very heavy, the very crushing cultural ethics that we find ourselves in, you're going to be attacked. And number 5, civilian preeminence. The United States incorporates the principle of civilian superiority to the armed services. The effect of this, from an ethical perspective, is to place a certain escape hatch between military leaders and their responsibility of constitutional values. While the Nuremberg Principle forbids the military to relinquish personal ethical responsibility for their decisions, the civilian government can cite its constitutional superiority in support of its prerogative to interpret said ethics. At the national level, it would be unacceptable for a military leader to challenge that presumption, and it must be borne in mind The controversial issues are rarely clear-cut ones where the Constitution is concerned. As a practical matter, the Constitution is what the executive branch of the government says it is, except in those occasional instances where what amounts to a priesthood of this surrogate divinity, the Supreme Court, assumes the prerogative to interpret the Constitution, much in the same way that ancient Egyptian priests sought to interpret the will of Amun-Ra, or that medieval scholars sought to interpret Christian scriptures through canon law. So again, on a personal level, I find myself in a situation where the rules, the simple code of conduct that has been established in the institution that I work for is not being followed. It is being ignored by the civilian leadership that I find myself being, supervised by. And many of you may find that in your lives also, right? Again, I'm looking around, I'm saying, here's the code of conduct that we're supposed to follow. It was assigned by the board of directors. It's a very simple set of rules. I was hired to enforce this simple set of rules, yet my superiors told me I have no authority to enforce those rules, that I am not allowed to enforce those rules, right? So again, we have this kind of civilian leadership that has taken it upon themselves to say, no, this is how we're going to do things. It doesn't matter that established orders and laws and rules and regulations have already been put in place by a committee. We're going to ignore those things. You're not allowed to use the tools available. And you need to stand down, right? We see that in the military. We see that in our own lives, okay? In the military, you say, listen, you trained me as a soldier. Here's the tools and tactics that I've learned. I can create the situation that you are asking me to do, but you're telling me that I'm not allowed to use the tools that I've learned. Use the training that I've learned. And that's where we run into these kind of nonsensical, never-ending falsehoods. Number 6, the continuing ethical challenge. What the 4 principles discussed above illustrate is that it is no easy matter to determine or apply ethics within the American military culture. Ethics is an elusive concept whose very vagueness leaves the individual uncertain as to just what his actual responsibility is, to say nothing of how he should apply it. Right. So we're going to leave it there for this episode. That might be a difficult place to leave off, but I think it's an important one. Okay? We're talking about living in a world where the culture, the institutions around us say that this is what we're supposed to be doing. Things should be like this. But then when we go to do these things, we're told we can't, right? Again, this is part of the mind war. It's multi-layered. You might have in one column everything that you need to do written in black and white. But everything that you're allowed to do is over here in the culture, in the ethics of that culture, and this is gray, right? And we are forced to live in this gray world where things could easily be handled with the black and white. Things are written down. We could simply follow those rules, right? But because cultural dictates and cultural ethics say, well, no, that's not fair. Well, then why do we have the rules if they're not fair? This, again, is part of the mind war. These are things that you need to look at in your life. what scenarios that you're in the situation that you find yourself in, right? How are you going to react to that scenario when it happens to you? When you were brought in, hired into a position to accomplish a specific goal, and then you're told you can't accomplish that goal. Again, for me, I made my very best attempt to say, here's the situation. Here's an honest look at what is going on in this institution that I work for. Here's the massive amount of failures that are happening, that are occurring daily. And if unaddressed, if we do not address these failures, this is what I believe is going to happen in the future. Those things are now happening, right? So I had to make a tactical change. And instead of fighting against it and saying, no, we have to do this, I'm going to enforce these rules, whether you like it or not, I said, okay, hands off. You guys win this round. You win this battle. We're not going to enforce the rules. We're going to allow bad behavior to continue. And what we're seeing, or what I'm seeing, is that bad behavior is getting worse and worse every day. And now those people who, again, were the superiors, supervisors, who said, no, you can't use the rules and regulations and tools that we hired you on to do. Now they're looking around and going, oh boy, something bad is happening here. Something wrong is happening here. And eventually those changes will come. It just is going to take time. That's part of mind war. Those are the things that you need to recognize in your life. What do you have the ability to actually change? And what do you have to realize? Hey, this is just how things are for now, right? If they are going to continue this way, then I'm going to have to adjust and make changes in my life. Or those changes will happen in this institution. And then we can carry on with the mission, right? So do not be discouraged. Remember, take an honest look at your life. Take an honest look. Do not lie to yourself about the scenario that you have control of versus the situation that you find yourself in. Okay? What is your Aristos? What is the best possible scenario for your given situation? Thank you for listening to this episode of Mind War. Again, you can find my art on Instagram, my videos on YouTube. There's a link in my bio to my Etsy shop for all kinds of great hoodies and sweatshirts and hats and beanies. Thank you for listening. I truly appreciate it. Your friend Victor, the Occult Technician.